What this alien revealed to a pastor about the return of Jesus will shake everything you believe. Before the story is over, you will question every teaching about faith, salvation, and the true second coming of Christ. But you need to listen until the end. Because what happened to Arthur Vance on that cold November night didn't just change his life, it could change yours, too. Before we dive deeper, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of tea, or just some water, and sit back as we begin this journey together. Now, let's go back to that night Arthur Vance would never forget. The old Baptist church in Ashland, Kentucky was completely silent when Arthur Vance locked the front door at 11:47 p.m. that Thursday. At 65, with graying hair and shoulders hunched by the weight of decades of ministry, he had a habit of spending hours alone in the empty church after everyone else had left. Kneeling on the same wooden pews where he had preached for 38 years, he prayed. He prayed for answers. He prayed for the soul of his deceased wife. He prayed for a sign that everything he had believed his entire life truly made sense. But the answers never came. That night was especially cold. The wind blew hard through the trees surrounding the church, sending dry leaves dancing across the empty parking lot. Arthur adjusted his thick coat and descended the 3 concrete steps to the entrance, keys still in hand. His footsteps echoed in the silence of the night as he walked toward his pickup truck, parked under the only working street light. That's when he saw it. A figure standing next to his pickup truck, completely still, just watching. Arthur stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding. The figure was about 50 feet away. But there was something deeply wrong about that silhouette. Even from this distance, even in the dim yellowish light of the street lamp, Arthur could tell it wasn't normal. "Hello," he called, trying to keep his voice steady. "The parking lot is closed. The church opens tomorrow at 9:00 the morning." The figure didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there like a statue watching. Arthur felt a shiver run down his spine. His fingers tightened around his keys. Maybe it was just someone in need of help. Maybe a homeless person seeking shelter. He was a pastor after all. It was his duty to help. But something about that figure made every fiber of his being scream at him to run. "Do you need something? Are you lost?" Arthur took 2 more cautious steps forward, trying to get a better look. And then the figure moved. It didn't walk. It didn't take normal steps. It simply slid a few feet to the side, out of the shadow of the pickup truck, and into the streetlight. Arthur froze. The figure was human-shaped. 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, but everything was wrong. The proportions weren't quite human. The arms were slightly longer, the torso narrower, and the way the thing moved, so fluid, so silent, was completely unnatural. "Lord Jesus," Arthur whispered, taking a step back. His brain struggled to process what he was seeing. This couldn't be real. Maybe he was having a seizure. Maybe he was having a nervous breakdown. Since Eleanor's death, he hadn't slept well. Maybe this was it. A hallucination, extreme exhaustion. But then, the thing turned its face toward him, and Arthur saw its eyes. Too big, too dark, no white around them. Just 2 shiny black surfaces that reflected the streetlight like liquid mirrors. Arthur's blood ran cold. All the stories he'd preached for decades about good and evil, God and the devil, angels and demons came rushing back to him in a flood of pure terror. Demon. It was a demon. It had to be a demonic manifestation. Satan trying to deceive him, to test him in a moment of weakness. "I rebuke you in the name of Jesus Christ," Arthur shouted, raising his trembling hand in the air, making the sign of the cross. "You have no power here. This is the house of the Lord." The figure didn't back away. It didn't disappear in a puff of smoke like in the movies. It just tilted its head slightly to the side as if curious, studying him. And then Arthur heard. It wasn't a sound. It didn't come through his ears. It was a voice, clear and calm, that came directly into his head, as if someone were speaking in the center of his brain. "Arthur Vance, I'm not what you think, and I didn't come to hurt you." Arthur staggered back, nearly tripping. His hands were shaking violently. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. He was having a psychotic episode, or he was asleep. It had to be a nightmare. "Come out of me, you unclean spirit," he shouted, his voice cracking. I am a servant of the Most High God. You cannot touch me. I don't want to touch you, Arthur. I just want to talk. I've come to bring answers to the questions you ask every night alone in this empty church. How did that thing know that? How did it know his name? How did it know he spent nights praying alone? Arthur felt his legs weaken. He looked around desperately. The parking lot was deserted. No cars were passing on the road. No lights were on in the distant houses. He was completely alone with that thing. "What do you want from me?" he whispered, his voice sounding weak, defeated. The figure took a step forward. Just one, and Arthur saw more details in the light. The skin had a slightly grayish hue, but it glowed almost imperceptibly, as if a very faint light emanated from within. The hands had long, delicate fingers, and there was something about the posture, the way the being held itself, that conveyed a strange calm. "I've come because you're ready for the answers you've been asking for, Arthur. Ready to hear truths that have been misunderstood for millennia. Truths about the one you call Jesus Christ, and about the return you so long await." Arthur's heart was pounding so hard he could feel the pulse in his neck, in his temples. This was a temptation. It had to be. The devil masquerading as an angel of light, just as the scriptures warned, telling half-truths mixed with lies to deceive even the elect. But why then couldn't he move? Why did his feet feel stuck in the gravel? Why, despite his absolute terror, was there a tiny part of him curious? "I won't listen to lies from demons," Arthur said, trying to sound firm. But his voice was shaky. "The Bible says that the Bible says many things, Arthur. Some have been misunderstood, some have been distorted, and you know it. Deep down in your heart, you've always known there was something incomplete. Why do you think you spend whole nights praying without receiving answers?" The words hit Arthur like a punch to the gut. How did this thing know exactly what he felt? The doubt that had been gnawing at his heart since Eleanor's death. The feeling that something was missing in everything he'd preached for 38 years. "You're going to deceive me," Arthur whispered more to himself than to the being. "You're going to make me doubt. You're going to drive me away from God." "No, Arthur. I'm going to bring you closer to Him in a way you never imagined possible. But first, you have to choose. You can get in that truck and drive away. Pretend this never happened. Continue living with the same questions, the same doubts until the end of your days." The figure paused, and Arthur felt the weight of that silence. "Or you can stay, listen, and discover that Jesus' return is not what you were taught." Arthur squeezed his eyes shut. He took a deep breath. Every cell in his body screamed danger. But there was something else. A magnetic pull, a deep need to know. When he opened his eyes again, the figure was still there, motionless, just watching, waiting. And Arthur Vance, a retired Baptist pastor, widowed, broke, and full of doubts, made the decision that would change everything. He didn't get into the pickup truck. Arthur didn't move. He stood there, his keys still clutched in his hand, staring at that impossible figure in the dim streetlight. His brain screamed that this was madness, that he should run, call someone, do anything but stay there. But his feet would not obey. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was desperation, or maybe deep down Arthur Vance was just too tired of pretending he had all the answers. Because the truth he never admitted to anyone, not even himself, was that he was completely lost. He was 65 years old, alone, and every certainty he had built up over decades was crumbling like sand through his fingers. It all started the night Eleanor died. 8 months ago, Arthur held his wife's hand as she struggled to breathe in that hospital bed. 43 years of marriage. 43 years by his side in ministry, playing the piano at services, leading Bible studies, smiling at the congregation as he preached about faith and salvation. But as death approached, as the monitors began to beep, and the doctors rushed in, Eleanor clutched Arthur's hand with desperate strength and whispered words he would never forget. "Arthur, I'm afraid. What if I'm not truly saved? What if I haven't done enough?" He tried to comfort her. He quoted verses. He prayed. He told her she was one of the most devout women he knew. But her eyes were filled with pure terror. Terror of not being good enough. Terror of a God who might reject her despite a lifetime dedicated to Him. And then she was gone. Arthur returned to that empty house in rural Kentucky. And for the first time in 38 years of ministry, he couldn't pray. He sat in the living room chair in absolute silence, and a question ate at his mind like acid. If Eleanor, who dedicated her entire life to the church, who never harmed anyone, who loved God with every fiber of her being, died afraid that she would not be saved, then what had he been preaching all this time? In the months that followed, Arthur tried to keep going. He kept going to church. He kept praying. But something was broken inside him. He would look at his congregation on Sundays and see the same fear in their eyes. Fear of not being good enough. Fear that Jesus would return and leave them behind. Fear of a God who needed to be constantly appeased, feared, obeyed under threat of eternal damnation. Was this what Jesus really taught? Was this the gospel Arthur should have been preaching? He began to avoid people. He began spending more time alone in the empty church, kneeling in those ancient pews, begging for answers that never came. His daughter Catherine called twice a week from Nashville, worried. But what could he tell her? That the pastor, who had preached unwavering faith for decades, was now doubting everything. The household bills were piling up. His pension barely covered expenses. The church offered financial help, but Arthur refused. How could he accept money from people who trusted him for spiritual guidance when he himself was completely lost? 2 weeks ago, he seriously considered abandoning everything, selling the house, moving to Nashville with Catherine and her husband, trying to live a normal life away from the church, maybe working part-time somewhere, maybe forgetting that he'd ever believed he had a divine mission. But even that felt empty. Because if he abandoned his faith now after 38 years of devotion, what would be left? Who was Arthur Vance without the church, without the prayers, without the hope, however fragile, that it all meant something? He was trapped, stuck between a faith that no longer satisfied him and the impossibility of living without it. Like a man slowly drowning, unable to swim, but refusing to sink completely. And now, there in that cold, empty parking lot, an impossible creature was standing in front of him, offering answers. Answers about Jesus, about the return Arthur preached for decades, about truths that might explain why he felt so empty, so incomplete, so lost, despite a lifetime dedicated to God. Arthur stared at the figure in the streetlight. The large, dark eyes remained fixed on him, patient, without judgment. There was something about that gaze that conveyed no threat. It was strange, otherworldly, impossible, but it didn't seem evil. "If you're a demon," Arthur began, his voice trembling, "if you're here to keep me from God, I need you to know that I have nothing left to lose. My wife is gone. My faith is in tatters. My entire life has been dedicated to preaching something that I now don't know was right." He took a deep breath, feeling tears burn his eyes. "But if you really have answers, if you can tell me why a godly woman died afraid she wouldn't be saved, if you can explain why I spent 38 years preaching and still feel empty, then I will listen, even if it condemns me. Because to continue like this, living with these doubts, is a hell worse than anything you could do to me." The silence that followed was absolute, just the wind rustling through the dry leaves and the distant hum of the streetlight. And then the voice came back soft and quiet inside Arthur's mind. "Your wife didn't die in fear because she wasn't saved, Arthur. She died in fear because she was taught that salvation was something external, something that depended on divine approval that could be denied. But that was never Jesus's actual teaching, and that's exactly what I need to talk to you about." Arthur felt his legs weaken. He held on to the side of the pickup truck to keep from falling. "Come into the church. You will feel safer inside. And I will show you things that will change everything you believe about the return of Christ." The figure began to move toward the church entrance. That fluid, unnatural movement, as if gliding over the ground without actually walking. Arthur stood there for a few more seconds, his heart hammering. Every instinct screamed danger, but the pain inside him, the desperate need for answers, was stronger than the fear. With shaking hands, he followed the figure back to the church he had just locked. And as he climbed the concrete steps, Arthur Vance didn't know if he was about to receive the greatest revelation of his life, or if he was making the biggest mistake a servant of God could make. But at that moment, he didn't care anymore. Arthur unlocked the church door with trembling fingers. The key scraped against the lock twice before it fit properly. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear the blood pounding in his ears. The figure remained a few steps behind him, silent, waiting. When the door finally opened, Arthur entered first, feeling his way along the wall until he found the light switch. The fluorescent lights flickered before turning on fully, illuminating the church's simple interior. Wooden pews lined the church, a modest pulpit at the front, white walls decorated only with a wooden cross. Nothing fancy, just a place of worship that had served the community for over 50 years. Arthur turned slowly, expecting to see the figure cross the threshold, and it was when he saw her fully in the bright, shadowless light of the church's interior that the real shock hit him. It wasn't human, not at all. The skin was a grayish hue with almost silvery highlights, too smooth, too perfect. The head was slightly larger than a human's, rounder. The eyes, those enormous, completely black eyes, didn't blink. They were like two deep wells that reflected the lamplight like liquid surfaces. The being was about 5'7" tall, with a thin, delicate body, almost fragile in appearance. He wore what looked like clothing, but it was difficult to tell where the clothing ended and the skin began. Everything seemed integrated, as if it were a second skin of a different material. Arthur instinctively backed up until he was against the first bench. His mind went into complete panic. "This isn't real," he whispered to himself. "It can't be real." He blinked several times, closed his eyes tightly, and opened them again. The figure was still there, standing near the door, watching him with those impossible eyes. "I'm having a nervous breakdown," Arthur said aloud, as if speaking could make it less real. "The stress, the loneliness, Eleanor's death. I've finally broken. This is a hallucination. I need to call Catherine. I need to go to the hospital." He reached into his pocket with a trembling hand, searching for his cell phone. But he couldn't take his eyes off the creature. "You're not hallucinating, Arthur." The voice echoed inside his head again, calm and patient. "And I know it's hard to accept what you're seeing, but I'm really here." "No." Arthur shook his head violently. "There's no such thing. There are no aliens. There are no whatever you are. It goes against everything." He paused, his breath quickening. His theological training, decades of Bible study, all struggled to find a rational explanation. "You're an angel," Arthur said suddenly, grasping at the possibility. "An angel who has taken on a different form. The Bible says they appear in different forms. I am not an angel in the sense, you know," the voice interrupted gently. "I am a being from another world, from another solar system. I have traveled a distance your mind cannot fully comprehend to be here." "Another world," Arthur repeated, his voice coming out as an incredulous whisper. "You're saying you're from another planet, like in the movies, like science fiction." But even as he spoke, part of his brain was already processing what he saw. The way the being moved, the texture of its skin, the eyes that were clearly not human, the voice that came directly into his mind without any lips moving. This wasn't something his imagination could create. It was too detailed, too specific, too strange. "Why are you here?" Arthur asked, trying to maintain some control over the situation. "Why, in a small church in rural Kentucky, why show up to me?" The creature took a step forward, and Arthur flinched against the bench, but the being stopped immediately, sensing his discomfort. "I've come because you're ready, Arthur. Because your questions have opened a door, and because humanity's moment has reached a tipping point." "Critical point," Arthur echoed. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the awakening that's happening on your planet. About the return that you and millions like you are waiting for. But first, you need to understand something fundamental. The universe is much more vast and complex than you've been taught. And Jesus Christ, he wasn't just what you imagine." The mention of Jesus made something inside Arthur harden. Even with all the fear, even with all the confusion, this was a line he wasn't sure he could cross. "No," he said, his voice gaining an unexpected firmness. "Whatever you are, you will not distort Christ. He is the Son of God. He died for our sins. He did all this and more, Arthur. Much more than you've been told. But the story has been simplified, fragmented. Parts have been lost. Others have been altered to serve human purposes." Arthur felt anger begin to replace his fear. Anger at being manipulated. Anger that this impossible creature was there in God's house, talking about Jesus, as if he knew more than the scriptures. "Are you going to tell me the Bible is wrong?" he challenged. "That everything I've ever believed is a lie?" "No, Arthur. I'll tell you the Bible contains profound truths, but it was written by humans, translated by humans, interpreted by humans, and humans, no matter how well-intentioned, see through limited filters. They see through fear, the desire for control, the need for simple answers to complex mysteries." The creature moved slowly to one of the benches, and to Arthur's utter surprise, sat down. The movement was so human, so ordinary, that it created a bizarre contrast with its completely alien appearance. "Sit down, Arthur, please. I know you're scared. I know every cell in your body is screaming that this is impossible, but you asked for answers. You spent months praying for them. And now they're here, sitting in front of you." Arthur remained standing, gripping the bench, his body tense as a taut rope. His brain struggled between the urge to run and the overwhelming curiosity that kept him there. "How do I know you're not lying?" he asked. "How do I know it's not a way to deceive me, to lead me away from God?" "You don't know, Arthur. Not yet. But you will. I'm going to show you things, not just tell you. And you're going to feel the truth of them. Not because I forced you to believe them, but because something inside you, something that's always been there, will recognize them." The being inclined its head slightly, and for the first time, Arthur noticed something that felt like kindness, compassion. "But first, I need you to understand. I didn't come here to destroy your faith. I came to expand it, to show you that God is infinitely greater than any religion has ever captured, and that Jesus was far more extraordinary than even his most devout followers imagine." Arthur felt his legs weaken again. Slowly, very slowly, he sank down onto the bench behind him. His mind was a whirlwind of contradictory thoughts: fear, curiosity, resistance, a desperate need to understand. And at the center of it all, a question he could no longer ignore. What if it was real? What if this impossible creature actually held the answers he'd been searching for his entire life? What would he do with these answers? Arthur remained seated, his eyes fixed on the creature occupying the pew across from him. The silence of the empty church was oppressive, broken only by the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. He needed something concrete, something to prove this wasn't just his mind breaking down. "If you're real," Arthur began, his voice still trembling, "if you really came from another world, show me something. Some proof that I'm not just raving alone in this church." The creature remained motionless for a moment as if considering the request. Then slowly it raised one hand. "Okay, Arthur, you need evidence. That's understandable. Your kind has always needed seeing to believing." The being's hand, delicate with long fingers and no visible nails, began to glow. It wasn't a bright or blinding light. It was a soft, bluish glow emanating from the skin itself, as if there were something luminous just beneath the surface. Arthur held his breath. The glow gradually intensified, and then something extraordinary happened. Tiny points of light began to form in the air around the creature's hand, floating like tiny fireflies. They danced in the air, creating ever-changing patterns, forming something that looked like symbols, images. Arthur stood up instinctively, his eyes wide. This couldn't be a trick. There were no wires, no projectors, no visible technology. The lights simply existed, suspended in the air of the old church, defying every law of physics he knew. "What? How are you doing this?" he whispered. "Energy manipulation on a level your science hasn't yet fully grasped. But it's not magic, Arthur. It's just a deeper understanding of the laws that govern the universe." The lights began to rearrange themselves, forming a sort of sphere slowly rotating in the air. Within it, Arthur could see what appeared to be stars, galaxies. He stepped forward, mesmerized. This is space. A simple representation. Yes, I want you to understand where I came from and how vast is the universe that God, or as you prefer to call the source of all created." The sphere expanded, and Arthur saw hundreds, perhaps thousands of points of light. Some glowed brighter, others were just distant specks of brightness. Each of these points is a solar system. Each contains worlds, and many of these worlds harbor life, Arthur. conscious life. Civilizations that evolved just like yours. Some younger, some vastly older. Arthur felt his worldview begin to crack at the edges. All his life, he'd believed Earth was special, unique, the center of the divine plan. The idea that there were other worlds, other intelligent life forms, other civilizations. But the Bible never mentions. He began. But the Bible was written to a specific people at a specific time. Arthur, to people who had no concept of galaxies, of planets orbiting other stars, of distances that take light years to traverse. How would you explain the infinite universe to shepherds in the desert 2,000 years ago? The sphere of light suddenly collapsed, and the luminous points regrouped to form something different. A humanoid figure, but with an intense glow around it. Arthur immediately recognized the representation. Jesus, he whispered. Yes, but not just as you know it. Let me show you something that will challenge everything you believe. The luminous figure began to transform. The glow intensified until a human form was no longer visible. It was just pure, radiant light filling the space between the pews. And then, to Arthur's utter shock, the light began to split. 1 became 2. 2 became 4. 4 became dozens of tiny sparks of light that scattered through the air. What Jesus demonstrated was not exclusivity, Arthur. It was potential. He did not come to be worshipped as unique. He came to show the way, to demonstrate what every human being can become when fully awakened. Arthur felt his legs weaken again. He gripped the back of the seat in front of him for support. No. Are you saying that Jesus wasn't special? That he wasn't the Son of God? I'm saying he was exactly the Son of God, just like you are, just like every human is. The difference is he knew it completely, without a doubt, without fear. He activated the divine potential that exists within each of you. The small lights began to swirl around Arthur, creating a hypnotic pattern. He watched them half trance-like, while the voice continued inside his mind. When he said, "I and the Father are one," he wasn't claiming exclusivity. He was declaring universal truth. When he said, "You will do greater works than I have done," it wasn't false modesty, it was literal instruction. The potential is in everyone. But this contradicts everything, Arthur murmured, his voice trailing off. It contradicts the interpretation, Arthur. It does not contradict the essence of his teaching. The lights suddenly went out. The church was once again just an ordinary church lit by fluorescent lights, with wooden pews and a cross on the wall. The creature remained seated, watching Arthur with those impossible eyes. You asked for proof that I am real. I have shown you something your technology cannot reproduce, something that defies your understanding of reality. But the true proof, Arthur, will come from within you. The being slowly got up from the bench. I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to answer it with complete honesty. When you pray, when you're alone in this church in the wee hours of the morning, do you feel that God is distant or near? The question struck Arthur like a well-aimed arrow. He opened his mouth to answer, but couldn't because the truth was too painful to admit. Distant. God always seemed distant. No matter how much he prayed, no matter how much he dedicated himself, there was always a separation, as if there were an invisible glass between him and the divine. He tried, his voice breaking. I've always felt like I needed to try harder, pray more, be more worthy. Then maybe he finally listened to you. Maybe you were finally good enough. Arthur nodded slowly, tears beginning to burn his eyes. And when your wife was dying, afraid she wouldn't be saved despite a lifetime of devotion, what did that tell you about the God you preach? Tears began to stream down Arthur's face. He had no answer. Or rather, he had an answer he never dared admit out loud. That maybe, just maybe, something was deeply wrong with the way humanity understood God, with the way it understood salvation, with the way it understood Jesus' purpose. The separation you feel isn't real, Arthur. It never was. It's human construction, programming based on fear and control. God isn't far away. God isn't in some heaven up there judging your worthiness. God is within you, always has been, from the moment you were born. Then why? Arthur wiped away the tears with the back of his hand. Why have I never felt this? Why have I spent 38 years preaching and still feel empty? The creature took a few steps towards him slowly without threat. Because they taught you to look outside when you should look inside. They taught you to expect external salvation when it was always internal. They taught you that Jesus would return from heaven to save you, when in fact he planted the seed of awakening within every human being. Arthur felt as if the ground were disappearing beneath his feet. It wasn't physical fear of the creature anymore. It was something much worse. It was the feeling that everything he'd built, everything he'd believed, everything he'd taught for decades might be based on incomplete understanding. "Are you saying I wasted my life?" he asked, his voice breaking. "No, Arthur. I'm saying you did the best you could with the understanding you have. And now you're ready for something deeper. Something that will complete what you already know, not destroy it." The creature extended a hand toward him. Not to touch, just a gesture. "The return of Jesus is not him coming down from heaven, Arthur. It is you and millions of others awakening to the consciousness he demonstrated. It is the inner Christ which has always been within every human finally awakening, and this awakening is happening now all over the planet. You are feeling it even if you don't fully understand it." Arthur looked at that outstretched hand, at those impossible eyes that somehow conveyed more compassion than judgment. And for the first time in months since Eleanor's death, he felt something other than the emptiness that consumed him. Did you feel a tiny spark of hope? Or was it just desperation in disguise, grasping at anything that promised to ease the pain? He didn't know anymore. Arthur jerked back away from the creature's outstretched hand. His heart raced again, and the weight of everything he had just seen and heard crashed down on him like an avalanche. "No," he said, shaking his head violently. "No, no, no. This is wrong. All of this is wrong." He began pacing back and forth between the benches, his hands shaking, his breathing rapid. His mind went into full defense mode. "You're trying to confuse me. You're using tricks, some kind of advanced technology to make me doubt. This is exactly what the Bible warns about in the last days. Deceptive signs and wonders to lead astray, even the elect." "Arthur, no!" he shouted, spinning around to face the creature. "I've spent 38 years studying the scriptures. I know God's word, and it clearly says that Jesus will return in the clouds, that every eye will see him, that there will be trumpets and angels. Not this inner awakening you're talking about." Arthur pointed a trembling finger at the being. "You want me to believe that Jesus wasn't unique? That I can be like him? That's the oldest lie in Eden. You will be like God. That's exactly what the serpent told Eve." The creature didn't move. It just stood there, those enormous eyes fixed on Arthur with infinite patience. What if the serpent was telling a distorted truth, Arthur? What if the problem wasn't the statement itself, but the way it was presented, based on selfishness and separation rather than unity and love? "No," Arthur shouted again, starting toward the door. "I won't listen to this. I won't let you twist the scriptures. I won't." He stopped in the middle of the hallway, his hands clenched into fists. His entire body was shaking. "I'm going to get out of here. I'm going to go home. I'm going to forget this night ever happened. I'm going to—" "Are you going to keep praying alone in the void?" the voice interrupted gently. "Are you going to continue to feel separated from God? Are you going to continue to live with the guilt that perhaps you didn't comfort your wife adequately because deep down you weren't sure either?" The words hit Arthur like punches. He turned away slowly, tears streaming down his face. "How dare you?" he whispered. "How dare you use Eleanor against me? I'm not holding anything against you, Arthur. I'm showing you the pain you carry. The pain that millions carry because of teachings based on separation and fear instead of unity and love." Arthur slumped onto one of the benches, his head in his hands. Silent sobs shook his shoulders. "I can't do this," he murmured. "If I accept what you're saying, if I believe that everything I preached was incomplete, what's left? Who am I if not the pastor who dedicated his life to teaching the word?" He lifted his face, staring at the creature through his tears. "What if I'm wrong? What if you're right, and I spent 38 years leading people in the wrong direction? How many people have died like Eleanor, afraid they wouldn't be saved because of what I taught?" Guilt crushed his chest like a stone. He thought of all the people who had passed through that church, all the families he had counseled, all the sermons about staying vigilant, about fearing judgment, about waiting for Jesus to return to save them from a sinful world. What if all of this just took them away from what really mattered? No. Arthur stood abruptly. I can't accept this. Even though part of me wants to believe it, even though it makes some twisted sense, I can't. It would be betraying everything I swore. It would be betraying God. He started walking towards the door again, determined this time, or would it finally truly honor him? Arthur stopped, his hand on the doorknob. Does God want you to fear him or to know him, Arthur? Does he want you to be an obedient servant or a conscientious child? Jesus called you friends, brothers. He said the kingdom was within you. He promised you would do even greater works. Does this sound like someone who wants to be worshipped from afar, or does he want you to become like him? Arthur's hand trembled on the doorknob. He couldn't turn it. What if I open this door and you disappear? He asked, his voice weak. What if this is just a hallucination or a dream and tomorrow I wake up doubting everything? So you go back to the life you had before. You keep praying without answers. You keep feeling empty. You keep waiting for a return that never comes the way you expect, because it's already happening in ways you haven't been taught to recognize. Arthur squeezed his eyes shut. Images flashed through his mind in rapid succession. Eleanor on her deathbed, her eyes filled with fear. The congregation, Sunday after Sunday, singing about heaven while living the internal hell of never feeling good enough. Himself, kneeling alone in this empty church, begging for a connection that always seemed out of reach, and those impossible lights floating in the air. The voice inside his head that didn't come from his ears, the otherworldly being sitting calmly on a bench, offering answers he'd sought his entire life. Why me? Arthur asked without turning around. If this is real, if you really came from another world to talk about Jesus, why choose a broken-down old pastor in the middle of nowhere? Why not show up for the Pope? For world leaders? For people who can really make a difference? Because it's not about hierarchies, Arthur. It never was. Jesus didn't choose kings and priests as apostles. He chose fishermen. He chose tax collectors. He chose the broken, the doubters, those who were ready to listen because they had nothing left to lose. The creature got up from the bench and walked slowly until it was a few feet away from Arthur. You are ready, Arthur. That's why I'm here. Because your pain has opened you. Your doubts have created space for deeper truth. And when you understand, really understand, you will radiate it to others, not through forced sermons, but through your own transformed being. Arthur finally turned, letting go of the doorknob. His face was streaked with tears, his eyes red. But there was something different about them now. Not exactly acceptance, but maybe openness. If I stay, he began hesitantly. If I listen to what you have to say, you promise you'll show me the truth. Not your truth, not some distorted version, but the real truth. I'll show you what was always there, Arthur. In the scriptures you studied, in the words of Jesus you preached. But I'll show you the layers that have been lost, the meanings that have been forgotten, the full message that has been fragmented over the centuries. The being tilted his head slightly. And you will feel it when it is true. Because something inside you, something that has never been touched by doctrine or dogma, will recognize it. It will resonate, not because I forced it, but because it has always been dormant, waiting to awaken. Arthur took a deep breath. He wiped his face with his hands. He straightened his shoulders as if preparing to carry an immense weight. Okay, he said finally, his voice still shaky, but with growing determination. But if at any point I feel like this is taking me away from God, the real God, not my limited understanding of him, I will stop. I will leave. And I will spend the rest of my life praying for forgiveness for having listened. Fair, the voice responded with something that sounded like respect. I just ask that you keep an open mind, that you allow your heart to feel beyond what your mind has been programmed to accept. May I do that? Arthur nodded slowly, and as he walked back to the bench, leaving the door closed behind him. Arthur Vance didn't know if he was about to receive the greatest blessing or make the biggest mistake of his life, but he knew one thing. He could not go back. Arthur sat back down on one of the benches, but this time closer to the creature. Not exactly comfortable, but less defensive. His hands were still trembling slightly, and he held them clasped in his lap as if in prayer. The creature stood for a few moments, those immense eyes watching Arthur with an intensity that wasn't threatening, but deeply penetrating, as if it could see beyond the surface, beyond the words, straight to the core of who he truly was. You need more than lights and words, Arthur. You need something you can't deny, even when you doubt it later. Something tangible. What do you mean? Arthur asked, his voice raw from crying. I can show you something, but it will require you to trust me for a few moments. It will require you to allow a deeper connection. Arthur felt the alarm go off again inside him. Connection? What kind of connection? I will touch your forehead, and through that touch, I will show you memories. Not my words, interpreted by your mind, but direct images, experiences I have lived, things I have seen, so that you understand that I am not here to deceive you. Every instinct in Arthur screamed at him to refuse. Let that creature touch him? Allow some kind of mental connection? It felt dangerous. It felt wrong. Will it hurt? He asked, feeling ridiculous for asking something like that. No. It'll be like watching memories, like daydreaming. You'll be conscious the whole time. And if you want to stop, just think about it, and I'll step aside. Arthur took several deep breaths. He closed his eyes, muttered a quick prayer for protection, and then nodded. Okay, do it. The creature approached slowly. Arthur felt a very close presence, and then the touch. It was unlike anything he'd ever felt. The being's skin was warm, incredibly smooth, and there was a faint electric tingle at the point of contact. Not unpleasant, just strange. And then the world around disappeared. Arthur was no longer in church. He was floating in infinite black space, surrounded by more stars than he had ever imagined possible. The vision was so vivid, so real that he could feel the immensity of the cosmos around him. He wasn't afraid. He was in absolute awe. This is where I come from, Arthur. My world orbits a star you call Zeta Reticuli. It's approximately 39 light-years from here. The view shifted. Arthur saw a planet. It wasn't like Earth. It had deeper shades of blue, and 2 moons were visible in the sky. Cities sprawled across the surface, but they weren't like human cities. They were organic, fluid, integrated with the natural landscape in ways Arthur couldn't fully comprehend. My people evolved long before yours. When Jesus walked the earth, we were already traveling among the stars. We had already overcome wars, divisions, ego-based thinking, and separation. The image shifted again. Arthur saw beings like the one touching his forehead. Dozens of them, hundreds, moving through crystalline structures, working with technologies that seemed like magic to his eyes. And we have watched the earth. We have watched for a long time, because you are at a critical stage of evolution. A stage my people passed through millennia ago. The moment when a species decides whether to destroy itself or to awaken to its true nature. The images began to speed up. Arthur saw scenes from human history, wars, destruction, but also moments of beauty, art, music, people helping each other, genuine love between human beings. And then 2,000 years ago in Earth time, something extraordinary happened. The scene changed to something that made Arthur's heart stop. He saw a being of light. Not exactly like the creature that had touched him, but not entirely human either. It was something in between, something radiating an energetic frequency that Arthur could sense even through his vision. One of us volunteered. It wasn't just my people. It was a council of several advanced civilizations. Someone needed to incarnate on Earth. Someone needed to plant the seed of awakening in the human collective consciousness. Arthur saw the being of light descending. He saw it becoming denser and denser, more physical, and then he saw a baby being born in a manger. No, Arthur whispered, but the word echoed only in his mind. Are you saying that Jesus was one of you? He was, and he was not. He was advanced consciousness that chose to incarnate fully as a human, to be born as you are born, to grow as you grow, to feel pain, joy, fear, love, everything that makes you human. Because only by experiencing this fully could he demonstrate the way. The images continued. Arthur saw Jesus as a child. He saw him learning, growing, but there was something about him, something that shone even when he didn't fully understand who he was. He didn't have full memories of where he came from. Not consciously, that would have interfered with the mission. He needed to find out for himself, awaken gradually, become an example of what every human can achieve. Arthur saw the adult Jesus. He saw the baptism in the Jordan River. And in that moment something changed. An activation occurred. The Christ consciousness fully awakened in that human body. And then, he taught not through complex dogma, but through simple love, healing, compassion, demonstration that humans are much more than they imagine, that they can transcend limitations, that they carry divinity within themselves. The scenes sped up, the miracles, the teachings, the crowds. But Arthur saw everything from a different angle. Now he saw how Jesus tried to explain concepts to people who had no context to understand, how he used metaphors and parables because complete truth would be immediately rejected. He tried to say, "You will do greater works, and the kingdom is within you. I and the Father are one, and you can be one too." But the people weren't ready. They wanted an external savior. They wanted miracles without having to do the internal work. And then Arthur saw the crucifixion. But not as he had always imagined. He saw Jesus conscious to the end, without anger, without judgment, just pure love, even for those who were killing him. He knew that the physical body did not matter. He went beyond it. It was the final demonstration. Consciousness transcends flesh. Death is not the end. And when he was resurrected, Arthur saw the empty tomb. He saw Jesus appearing to the disciples. But there was something about this vision that was different from the biblical accounts. Jesus wasn't simply in a normal physical body. There was something fluid about him, as if he were partially in between dimensions. He showed that when you fully awaken to Christ consciousness, you transcend physical limitations. You can manipulate matter. You can exist beyond the body. You can literally become one with the creative source. The vision began to slow. Arthur saw Jesus saying goodbye to the disciples, and then saw ships, structures of light in the sky, observing, witnessing. We were there, Arthur, watching, protecting when necessary, witnessing the moment the seed was planted in the collective consciousness of humanity, the seed that would take 2,000 years to germinate, but now is blossoming. The images began to fade. Arthur felt himself being pulled back to the church, back to his physical body sitting on the wooden pew. The touch on your forehead disappeared. Arthur opened his eyes slowly. He was shaking, not from fear, from something much deeper. Tears were streaming down his face, but he didn't even notice them. "I saw," he whispered. "I really saw. That wasn't my imagination. Those weren't words I interpreted. Those were real memories." Arthur looked at the creature with completely different eyes. Now, there was no longer fear. There was awe, reverence perhaps. Jesus was. He was one of you who became one of us to show us what we can be, and he never really left. He's inside all of us, dormant, waiting to be activated. Arthur brought his hands to his face. Silent sobs shook his shoulders. But it wasn't despair. It was something else entirely. It was as if something that had been locked inside him for decades had finally found its key. "Eleanor," he cried. Eleanor didn't die in fear because she wasn't saved. She died in fear because no one, not even me, knew how to explain that salvation isn't an external event. It's an internal awakening. It's recognizing the Christ who was always within her. "Yes, Arthur, and now you understand. Now you're ready to hear about the return." Arthur looked up, his eyes red but intense, hungry for more truth. Tell me all about Jesus' return, what it really means, what's really happening." And for the first time since the creature appeared, Arthur Vance was no longer resisting. I was finally ready to listen. The creature sat back down on the bench across from Arthur. There was something different in the air now. The tension was gone. The fear had dissolved. What remained was a deep, almost desperate curiosity in Arthur. He leaned forward, his hands still shaking, but no longer from fear, from anticipation. "Then explain it to me," Arthur said, his voice still, but firm. "If Jesus never really left, if the Christ is within every person, what does it mean when the Bible talks about the second coming, about him returning in the clouds, about every eye seeing?" "I'll explain it to you, Arthur. But you need to understand that I'm going to use language that may seem strange at first, concepts that your traditional theology doesn't address. Are you willing to listen anyway? Yes, Arthur replied without hesitation. I need to know. The creature tilted its head slightly, a gesture that Arthur was beginning to recognize as contemplation. Everything in the universe is consciousness, Arthur. Everything vibrates at different frequencies. Solid matter is just consciousness vibrating very slowly. Light is consciousness vibrating rapidly. And between these extremes are infinite layers, infinite dimensions of reality. Arthur frowned, trying to keep up. When Jesus walked the earth, he operated primarily in the physical frequency, what you experience as three-dimensional reality. But he had conscious access to much higher frequencies. That's why he could heal instantly. That's why he could multiply loaves of bread. That's why he could walk on water. He manipulated consciousness on levels most humans can't access. Like he has powers, Arthur asked. Not external powers, Arthur. Internal access to universal laws that have always existed. He knew, not believed. He knew that thought creates reality. That focused intention can rearrange matter. That love in pure frequency can cure any disease because disease is just energetic disharmony. Arthur felt something resonate within him. Words he should have dismissed as heresy, but which somehow made profound sense. And when he ascended after resurrection, what really happened was a frequency shift. He didn't go to a physical place in heaven. He expanded into a frequency of consciousness where he was no longer limited by a dense body. But he never left Earth. He never left humanity. He just changed form. So he's here now? Arthur asked, looking around the church as if he could see him. It's everywhere, Arthur. In the same way that the air you breathe is everywhere. You don't see it, but it's there. Christ consciousness permeates everything. It's available to anyone who tunes in to the right frequency. The creature paused, and Arthur realized it was giving him time to process. Now, about the return, humans interpreted it literally. They thought Jesus would return physically, descending from heaven in a dramatic event, visible to all. But this is the interpretation of people who do not understand how consciousness works. So, what do the scriptures really mean? Arthur leaned forward even further. They mean collective awakening. When Jesus said, "I will return," he wasn't talking about his physical body. He was talking about the Christ consciousness returning through humanity. Person by person, heart by heart, mind by mind. Arthur felt something explode inside his chest, as if a door that had been locked for decades had finally been opened. The return is happening now, Arthur. Right now, all over the planet, millions of people are awakening, questioning old systems, rejecting fear-based religions, seeking direct connection with the divine within themselves, sensing that there is something deeper than they have been taught. I've felt it, Arthur whispered. In the last few months, I've sensed people in the congregation questioning more, feeling dissatisfied with ready-made answers, searching for something deeper. Exactly. Because the seed that Jesus planted 2,000 years ago is germinating now. The time of gestation is over. The time of birth has arrived. And this birth is the collective awakening of Christ consciousness in humanity. The creature stood up and began walking slowly between the benches. Arthur turned to follow it with his eyes. Every person who awakens to their inner divine nature is Jesus returning through them. Every person who chooses love over fear, unity over separation, compassion over judgment, is allowing Christ consciousness to live through them. But the Bible talks about signs, Arthur argued, not defensively but genuinely curious. Wars, earthquakes, famines, all this before the return. And you have all this, don't you? But these are not divine punishments, Arthur. They are symptoms of a planet in transition. Old structures based on fear and control are collapsing. And before the new is born, there is always chaos. There is always resistance. It is natural law. The creature stopped and turned to Arthur. Humanity is undergoing the greatest transformation of consciousness since Jesus walked the earth. They are evolving from a consciousness based on ego and separation to a consciousness based on unity and love. And it is not easy. It is painful. It is frightening. It feels like the world is falling apart because it is, Arthur muttered. Yes, the old world is crumbling. The world where God was external, where salvation came from outside, where humans were unworthy and small, where Jesus needed to return to save them because they couldn't save themselves. That world is dying. Arthur felt the tears start again, but they were different now. They weren't tears of despair, they were tears of recognition. And a new world is being born, a world where each person recognizes their inner divinity, where salvation is awakening to who you really are, where Jesus is not a distant savior but an example of what you can become, where his return happens through you when you awaken. But does that mean, Arthur began, his mind working rapidly, does that mean there is no external heaven and hell? No final judgment where some are saved and others are damned? There are states of consciousness, Arthur. Heaven and hell are real, but they are internal. They are frequencies of being. When you live in love, gratitude, peace, compassion, you are literally in heaven. When you live in anger, fear, hatred, judgment, you are literally in hell. Here, now, not after death. The creature sat back down, and final judgment is not God sitting on a throne deciding your fate. It's you confronting all the choices you've made, all the pain you've caused, all the love you've given. No filters, no excuses, and you decide for yourself if you're ready for higher frequencies or if you need more experiences to learn. Arthur was silent for a long time. His brain processed information that contradicted decades of theological training, but something in him, something deep and ancient, recognized the truth in the words. So when Jesus said, "No one comes to the Father except through me," Arthur began slowly. Wasn't he saying that only Christians are saved? I was saying that the way to God is through Christ consciousness. And Christ consciousness doesn't belong to religion, Arthur. It doesn't belong to Christians. It belongs to anyone who chooses love, who chooses awakening, who chooses to see divinity in themselves and in others. Can Buddhists have Christ consciousness? Arthur asked, knowing that the old version of him would consider it heresy. Yes, Muslims can have it, Hindus can have it, atheists can have it, because Christ is not Jesus's last name. It is a state of being. It is a frequency of consciousness available to everyone. Arthur covered his face with his hands. It was too much. Everything he believed in was being rewritten. But instead of feeling like he was losing something, he felt like he was gaining something immensely greater. And Eleanor, he whispered through his tears. If she had understood this, if I had known how to explain it to her. She understands now, Arthur. Death is not the end. It is merely a transition to a different frequency. And when consciousness leaves the body, many things become clear that were unclear while in physical form. Arthur looked up, his eyes wide. You're saying she's okay? That she wasn't rejected? I'm saying that the concept of divine rejection never existed. It was a human creation based on fear. The source of all things, what you call God, does not reject his own creations. How could a truly loving parent reject his children? Something inside Arthur completely broke in that moment. All the chains of guilt, fear, and inadequacy he'd carried his entire life simply dissolved. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, Arthur Vance felt free. Arthur sat in silence for several minutes. The empty church around them looked different now. The same white walls, the same wooden pews, the same cross hanging on the wall, but everything had a different meaning, deeper, more alive. He looked at the creature, and for the first time since it had appeared, Arthur didn't see an alien being. He saw a teacher, a messenger, something he couldn't describe, but he knew was benevolent. You said I came because I'm ready, Arthur began, his voice steadier now. Ready for what exactly? To understand what really happens when someone awakens and to become a living example of it, not through preaching about concepts, but through being transformed by them. The creature leaned forward slightly. Arthur, for 38 years you have preached Christ. Now it is time to embody Christ, to allow that consciousness to live through you in ways it has never lived before. But how? Arthur asked, genuinely lost. I can't perform miracles. I can't heal people. I can't walk on water. I'm just an old shepherd with more doubts than certainties. And that's exactly why it's ready. There was something about the voice that sounded like affection, because he finally let go of the arrogance of thinking he had all the answers. He finally allowed himself to be vulnerable. And vulnerability, Arthur, is the gateway to true strength. Arthur felt something tighten in his chest. It wasn't pain, it was recognition. Let me explain to you something fundamental about how consciousness works, something Jesus tried to teach but was misunderstood. The creature extended one hand, and again tiny lights began to dance around its long fingers. But this time Arthur wasn't afraid. He just watched in fascination. Everything that exists is energy vibrating at different frequencies. Thoughts are energy. Emotions are energy. Words are energy. And energy always seeks resonance. Like two tuning forks vibrating at the same frequency. The lights formed wave-like patterns in the air. When you feel fear, anger, judgment, guilt, you are vibrating at a low, dense frequency. And that frequency attracts experiences that correspond to it. Aggressive people, difficult situations, illness, not as punishment, but as a natural resonance. Arthur nodded slowly, beginning to understand. But when you feel genuine love, deep gratitude, inner peace, compassion, you vibrate at a high frequency. And that frequency attracts experiences that match it. Synchronicities, loving people, healings, opportunities. It's universal law, not divine favor. Is this what Jesus meant when he said faith moves mountains? Arthur asked. Yes, but not faith as blind belief. Faith as inner certainty, as a vibration so aligned with what you desire that physical reality has no choice but to rearrange itself to match. Jesus didn't ask the mountains to move. He knew they were already moved on an energetic level and the physical just followed. The lights dissolved gently. And here's the secret that religions have missed. You don't have to beg an external God for anything. You don't have to be worthy. You don't have to suffer to deserve it. You just have to align your internal frequency with what you want to experience externally. Arthur felt as if veils were being removed from his eyes one by one. So when I prayed for things, he began slowly. I was vibrating at the frequency of lack of not having, and that attracted more lack. Exactly. Prayer based on desperation and supplication reinforces separation. It reinforces the belief that you are powerless, that you need outside intervention, that God is far away deciding whether or not to answer. The creature paused. But true prayer, the kind Jesus practiced, is different. It's gratitude for something as if it were already real. It's feeling the emotion of a desire fulfilled before it physically manifests. It's vibrating at the frequency of abundance, health, love, and then reality rearranges itself to match. That's why Jesus gave thanks before miracles, Arthur whispered. Memories of biblical passages taking on new meaning. He gave thanks for healing before anyone was healed. He gave thanks for the loaves before he multiplied them. Yes, because he knew that on an energetic level, it was already done. Physically, it was just a matter of time to achieve. And the more aligned the frequency, the less time it takes. Arthur stood up, shaken by the realization that flooded his mind. He began pacing between the benches, processing. So everything I taught about sin, about being unworthy, about needing to constantly repent, he stopped and looked at the creature. It kept people in a low frequency. It kept them feeling separated from God. It kept them in an internal hell, even when they went to church every Sunday. Yes, Arthur. And it wasn't mean. You taught what you were taught. You repeated centuries-old patterns. But now you see. And seeing is the first step to transformation. Arthur sat down again, but this time on the step leading to the pulpit, the place where he had stood countless times preaching to the congregation. Eleanor, he said softly. She died vibrating with fear. Fear of not being saved. And me, trying to comfort her, quoting verses about grace and salvation. I only reinforced the frequency of separation. I reinforced the belief that she needed external approval. You did the best you could with the understanding you had, Arthur. Don't carry guilt about it. Guilt is just another low frequency that will keep you trapped in the past. So, what do I do now? Arthur looked up, his eyes filled with tears, but also with determination. How do I change this? How do I become an example of Christ consciousness? The creature stood up and walked until it was a few steps below Arthur on the step. You start choosing, Arthur. In every moment, in every thought, in every emotion, you choose love over fear. You choose gratitude over complaint. You choose to see unity over separation. When someone angers you instead of judging, you choose compassion, recognizing that this person is simply operating from a level of consciousness they have reached so far. When something bad happens, instead of playing victim, you look for the lesson. You look for growth. You look for hidden opportunity. Arthur listened to every word as if his life depended on it. And most importantly, Arthur, you stop looking for God outside. You stop praying as if he were far away, evaluating whether you deserve him or not, and you begin to feel the divine presence within you. You begin to recognize that every breath, every heartbeat, every thought, it's all God expressing himself through you. What about the scriptures? Arthur asked. Do I just abandon them? No, you read them with new eyes. You look for what Jesus really said behind the translations and interpretations, and you will discover that everything I told you was already there, waiting to be seen by anyone who had eyes to see. The creature took another step towards Arthur. The kingdom of God is within you, not in some distant heaven. You will do greater works than I have done because potential is in everyone. I and the Father are one, and you can be two where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name. Because Christ is not a person. He is consciousness that can be accessed collectively. Arthur covered his face with his hands. Silent sobs shook his shoulders, but they weren't sobs of pain. They were sobs of deep relief, of release. I've spent my whole life looking outside, he cried, looking for approval, looking for signs, looking for Jesus to return from heaven to save me. And he's always been here, he pounded his chest. In here, waiting for me to stop looking outside and look inside. Yes, Arthur. And now that you see, now that you understand, you can't undo it. Expanded consciousness can't be contracted again. You have awakened, and that awakening will radiate to everyone around you without you having to do anything other than be who you truly are. Arthur wiped away the tears and looked at the creature with something new in his eyes. It wasn't doubt anymore. It wasn't fear anymore. It was certainty. You've come so far, he said softly. You've traveled distances I can't comprehend. Why? Because we were once like you, Arthur. We've been through the same transition, and others helped us when it was our turn. It's how the universe works. More advanced civilizations help those who are awakening, not by interfering directly, but by guiding, planting seeds of understanding in minds to receive. The creature tilted its head in a gesture Arthur now recognized. And you, Arthur Vance, are one of those minds. You will plant seeds in others, not through sermons on doctrine, but through the way you live, the way you love, the way you radiate peace, even in the midst of chaos. Others will sense it and will want what you have, and when they ask, you will know what to say. Arthur took a deep breath. He felt something solidify inside him, a decision, a commitment. I'm ready, he said. I don't know exactly what I'm going to do. I don't know how I'm going to explain this to others, but I'm ready to live it, to be an example of it, to let Christ, the real Christ, not the distorted version, live through me. And at that moment, something shifted in the church's energy. Not visibly, but Arthur felt it as if a frequency had been activated, as if something dormant inside him had finally awakened. The return of Jesus was happening now within him. The weeks that followed that night were the strangest and most transformative of Arthur Vance's life. The creature had departed shortly before dawn. There was no dramatic farewell, just a final telepathic message that echoed inside Arthur's mind as he watched the being walk toward the parking lot. Remember, Arthur, Jesus' return happens through you when you choose love over fear. You are not alone on this journey. Millions are awakening simultaneously, and together you are shifting the frequency of the entire planet. And then, the creature simply disappeared. It didn't enter a visible ship. It just took a few steps beyond the reach of the parking lot lights and was gone. Arthur stood still for a long time, watching the sky begin to lighten on the horizon. Part of him wondered if it had all been a hallucination, a vivid dream brought on by stress and loneliness. But something inside him knew it wasn't. Something had fundamentally changed, as if a switch had been flipped deep within him. For the first few days, Arthur didn't tell anyone. How could he? But he began to live differently. Little things at first. He would wake up in the morning and instead of starting the day with prayers of supplication, he would simply breathe deeply and feel gratitude. Gratitude for being alive, for being able to breathe, for being conscious. He wasn't thanking someone far away up there. He was simply vibrating at the frequency of gratitude, and the days began to flow better. Small synchronicities appeared. Opportunities arose. Nothing miraculous, just natural flow when you're not blocked by fear and resistance. Arthur also noticed that he woke up at 3 a.m. frequently, but not with the anxiety he used to feel. He felt incredible clarity. Ideas were flowing, insights were arriving, as if knowledge were being downloaded during his sleep. He wrote everything down in a notebook next to his bed. Salvation is not being rescued from something external. It is awakening to what has always been internal. Jesus will not return from heaven because he never left. He is returning through each person who awakens to Christ consciousness. I am part of that return. The first time he returned to church for Sunday service, Arthur stepped up to the pulpit with a strange feeling in his stomach. He had prepared a traditional sermon, but when he looked out at the congregation, he saw something he had never seen before. He saw people carrying burdens, people praying desperately for external salvation because they believed they were unworthy, people waiting for Jesus to return to solve their problems because they didn't believe they had internal power. And Arthur was unable to read his prepared sermon. He put away the notes. He was silent for a few seconds, and then he spoke from the heart. You know, I spent 38 years preaching about waiting for Jesus to return, waiting for reward in heaven. But recently, I learned something that changed everything. Jesus said, "The kingdom of God is within us, not somewhere far away. Within us, here now." What if that's literal? What if we don't need to wait for external salvation because we already have everything we need internally? Some faces showed discomfort. Others looked hopeful, as if finally someone was saying something that resonated. Arthur didn't preach for long that day. He just planted seeds. Some members left in the following weeks uncomfortable with the change in direction, and he understood. He didn't judge. Each person was at their own level of consciousness, but those who remained began to blossom. And Arthur felt something extraordinary happening within himself. He no longer felt alone the way he used to. There was a constant presence, no audible voice, just certainty, connection. 3 months after that night, Arthur sat in the empty church again. It was the middle of the night, but this time he wasn't there out of despair. He was there out of gratitude. When he'd called Catherine the week before for the first time since Eleanor's death, he'd been able to talk about his wife without the crushing weight of guilt. "You know, Kathy, I think your mother is okay, better than she's ever been. Because now she understands what I couldn't explain. That she never had to be afraid. That she was always loved." "Daddy, what happened to you?" Catherine asked. "You look different, lighter." "I learned that I spent my whole life looking for God outside when he was always inside." He pounded his chest. And that realization changed everything. That early morning at church, Arthur closed his eyes and simply connected. He felt a divine presence pulsing within him with every heartbeat. And then he felt it, that familiar telepathic presence. Arthur opened his eyes. The creature was there, standing near the door. "Arthur, I came to check on your progress, and I see you've been living what you've learned." "Well," Arthur smiled. "Were you watching? We always watch for those who awaken to celebrate each victory. Do you understand now? The return of Jesus is not a single future event, but a present collective process." "Yes," Arthur said with certainty. "I feel like something dormant inside me has finally woken up. Millions around the planet are experiencing similar awakenings. When critical mass is reached, the entire Earth will transform, and it's closer than most people realize." Arthur shivered. "And what is my role?" "Keep living by example. Keep being who you really are. You don't need to save the world. You just need to embody the consciousness that has awakened within you, and it will radiate naturally." The creature began walking towards the door. "Remember, Jesus' return is you waking up. It is humanity collectively becoming what Jesus demonstrated was possible." Arthur walked to the door. The sky was beginning to lighten. "Thank you for everything. You freed yourself, Arthur. I just showed you the door. You chose to walk through." And then the creature took a few steps, and simply was no longer there. Arthur stood there watching the sunrise, feeling the cool morning breeze, and for the first time in his entire life, he felt completely at peace. I didn't have all the answers, but I didn't need them anymore. He had connection. He had inner certainty. He had Christ alive within him. He would continue his journey each day, bringing new insights. Each moment of gratitude, connecting him more intensely with the divinity within. He was no longer the same man who spent nights on his knees begging for answers. Now he was a channel. He was a living example that Christ doesn't need to return from heaven because he is already returning through each person who awakens. One night, stargazing, Arthur thought of the creature, how it had traveled unimaginable distances to plant a seed of understanding, and he realized he had to do the same, radiate this frequency. Live this truth, be an example, because every person who awakens touches others, and eventually critical mass is reached. Arthur smiled at the stars. He knew there were beings watching up there, celebrating every human who chose to awaken. And he, an old shepherd who had almost given up on everything, was one of them now, part of the return of Jesus, not as a spectator waiting for salvation, but as an active participant embodying Christ consciousness. Arthur's journey shows us something profound. Sometimes the greatest truths arrive when we are most broken, when all our certainties crumble and we finally open ourselves to see beyond what we've always believed. What about you? Have you ever felt that there's something deeper than what you've been taught? Have you ever wondered if Jesus' return might mean something completely different from what you always imagined? Have you noticed changes in yourself? A gradual awakening, a search for a more real connection with the divine. If this story touched something within you, leave your thoughts in the comments. Share your own awakening journey, because every person who opens themselves to a deeper truth is participating in this collective return of Christ consciousness. Because in the end, perhaps the greatest miracle is not Jesus coming down from heaven, but you are awakening to the Christ that has always been within.